So in the last episode, we talked about importing from CSV files to create records in your Rails application. And in this episode, we're going to talk about exporting those same records. So we're going to use the same CSV library as before, and you're going to want to make sure that you have a require CSV inside your application.rb. So put that right before Rails/all's require statement, and restart your Rails application. That will make sure that you have the CSV library available in all cases. So once you have that, we're simply going to take our users route, and we're going to accept the format of CSV. So we're going to create a URL here called /users.csv, and this .csv file extension in the URL is automatically parsed by Rails as a format. So if we go to the users controller, first let's take a look at the routes. I have resources users, and that's going to be what sets up /users, of course. And when we come to the controller, we have the index action, and that will be what /users points you to. And in here, we simply need to respond to a new format. So by default, this will look for HTML or JavaScript templates or XML or JSON inside your views folder. But because we don't actually need a view for this, we're going to set up a respond to block. And we're going to say, let's continue responding to HTML, but let's also respond to the CSV format. And if we pass a block in here, it allows us to render a file. And all you need to do to render a file is send data. And this is simply going to send data back to the browser. So this sets up the response in such a way that it will download the CSV file. And since we've already queried for users, we have the @users variable, and we just need to convert this to CSV format. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to make a method called toCSV on the users class. So that model is going to have a class method that handles creating a CSV. So if we save this, we can open up the users model and scroll down here and create a self.toCSV method. Now, we could have some options here or whatever to determine if you want to add headers or not. So I'm always going to go with headers. I think headers are an important thing to use, especially you want to keep this consistent between your exports and your uploads. So if your imports require headers, make sure your exports also include the headers. If they don't, then don't worry about it. So keep those consistent so that you have the same format both directions. Now, to actually create the CSV, we use the csv.generate method, and this is just going to be passed in a block, and it will pass in the CSV as an argument. So we'll be building this in memory, and we'll return it back to the controller, which sends that to the browser. So one thing we want to do is this generate method takes the same options as the CSV import does. So if you are importing a CSV, you can set headers as true, and we're going to want to do the same thing with CSV's generate. So here we can say CSV, and then we want to create a row for those headers. So let's actually make a variable called attributes, and then we'll set this equal to one of the special array creation mechanisms in Ruby. If you use %w and then any sort of punctuation here, like curly braces, or you could use parentheses here or square brackets, this allows you to type words separated by spaces, and it will generate an array for you. So we can do that in the Rails console real quick. So if we do %w square brackets a b c, we'll get a string with, or an array of strings a, b, and c. And if we do %w parentheses a, b, c, d, e, f, then we'll get the same thing. So it's just a shortcut for creating arrays of strings, which I find really useful in a situation like this. So it makes this easy for us to say ID, we want the email, we want to export the first name, and let's also grab the last name. So we'll have these attributes here, and we can pass them in as the first row. So if you do CSV and shovel on an array, then this will tell the CSV to generate a new line with those columns. So it knows how to take an array like this and then convert that to one long string separated by commas. So what that's really just going to simply do is, if we want to take an array like that and we say we have A, B, and C as an array, so imagine our attributes variable is that. What the CSV shovel operator does here is simply take those attributes and then joins by your column separator, which is normally a comma. And that's it. That's all it does to generate a row, and then probably it's gonna append a new line character at the end, and then just build out your CSV format like that. So CSVs are really simple, but this library makes for a lot of shortcuts for us. So now that we've got that, we can use the all scope, and this will allow us to say for each of these users, then let's shovel on that record. And for the user, we want to grab their attributes, and then we want to get the values at attributes. And we use the splat operator here to make each of these items in the array a single argument to values at. So what this allows us to do is say, let's grab the last user. If we say last user.attributes, this gives us a hash with string keys for each of those. And then when we do values at, if we said ID, then it would give us the value in an array format, which is exactly what we want for our CSV. And then if we did something like email as the next parameter, it would give us 25 and then example@user.com. Now I want to point out here that using the all scope on here is not going to override the scope that we have in the user's controller. So if you use a different scope here, say maybe public users or not deleted users, this user's instance variable will get set to that. And then when you pass it in to the controller, or from the controller to the toCSV method, this will be like appending the scope of all onto the previous scopes. So this won't mess with your scopes at all. It will continue keeping the same scope. And in previous versions of Rails, that would have been scoped. But they switched that to all, and I think deprecated that old scoped method because this reads a little bit better. So that's as far as we need to go for handling CSVs. And now when we actually execute this /users.csv, we should get a downloaded file. And if we open that up, we get the attributes and all of the records there, just like we expect. So if we go and just modify one of these, let's delete the last name out of here, refresh the page, and then download the file again, we should get this time the same file without the last name. So everything's working correctly, and we can make adjustments as necessary. So this is really nifty, and it allows us to pull out attributes exactly from the records in the database. So this is really cool. One gotcha to this is that if you are using attributes, like maybe you have a name method here, and you don't want to use first and last name, if you want to do that, then you're going to have to set this up a little bit differently. See, this is not an attribute in the database. It's actually just a method on the instance. So in that case, you would want to adjust this and say name here instead, and rather than doing attributes, we're going to replace this with a loop around the attributes, and we're going to map that and create a new array, and this time we're going to take the attribute name, and then we're going to call user.send and pass in that attribute name. So what that will do is basically call a method by name. So if you have a user and we have the last user in the database, if we call send and we pass in name, it will call the method called name on the user. And we can do the same thing for things like ID if it's an attribute and that. So we'll loop through all of those, ask the user to call that method, take the result, put it in a new array using a map, and then shovel that into the CSV as a new row. So that is a way of using things like these sort of fake attributes that we've created, these helper methods around functionality like that. So it allows us to do a little bit more complex things. And then if we grab users.csv and open that file, you'll see now that we have the name column and we've copied both the first and last name into there. So that is a very simple introduction to importing and exporting from CSVs. I have a couple pro episodes to talk about uploading CSVs through forms if you're interested. This is very similar to pretty much exactly the same as what Ryan Bates covered in Railscast a long time ago. And the reason it hasn't really changed at all is because the CSV library is built into Ruby now. It uses the exact same functionality, and that's really it. If you don't use a gem or anything like that, not much is going to change. The API is pretty stable, and all you're going to need to do is add a couple lines to your controller and one method to your model to set that up. So this is a really simple way of doing that. You can also take a look at the send data method. Send data Rails is all you need to Google for that. And it gives you some options if you want to control things like the file name. So let's grab data streaming send data that we want to get. And so you can do disposition as inline or attachment. This is really cool if you're doing PDFs because you can force the download using attachment, or because browsers now render PDFs inside of them, you can do a disposition as inline to render it inline. Not sure if that works for CSVs, but let's try it. Disposition inline, save that, and see what happens. So CSVs are going to get downloaded because they don't actually have the ability to really render a CSV. It's just plain text, but that's kind of what you might expect. So you can also pass in like the option of file name, and imagine that you want the current date attached in there. So you might have users-date.today as your string, and now if you go to users.csv, the file you get downloaded will be that file name. So you'll also want to make sure you get the .csv in there to control that. But this is going to be useful so that you can create your own file name format, so that users.csv, the file name and the URL that you accessed, isn't converted directly. So as you saw before, I had users and the browser was doing parentheses 1 and 2 and so on. This allows you to kind of set this up on your own and follow the format that you would prefer. So something like dates and times is very common to do. But it's really up to you. If you're scoping things out and people are searching, you might want to put some of those search queries in the file name. But yeah, that's the basics of exporting CSVs. So if you have any questions, please post a comment and I'll see you next episode.